Hi, good evening. I'm Jochen Hinkel. I'm a researcher based in Berlin at the Global Climate Forum, and I'm working on climate change adaptation, predominantly in the coastal zone. I'm also an IPCC lead author working on the IPCC reports. We are here in a small town, Aberdour, next to Edinburgh in Scotland, and we're here because we are for a workshop that is called KNET Workshop, and the workshop tries to promote different ways for bringing about change, bringing about transformations to solve environmental and social problems we are facing, such as climate change, for example. Right. I mean, the issues involved in climate change adaptation, they're quite diverse. So we know that climate change is going to bring about changes in climate variables in different locations on the world. So that means changes in temperature and precipitation, in winds and storms, and possibly also changes in the ocean circulations that affect temperature, for example, here in Scotland. And all those changes then have impacts on people living in different geographic areas, such as higher storm surges when the winds and the floods are coming, or more frequent extreme precipitation events, or more frequent droughts, so agricultural production is threatened by that, etc. My I'm predominantly working on coastal adaptation. So at the coast, this involves the impacts of higher storm surges, also the permanent inundation of low-lying areas if sea level is rising. Other impacts that have been observed and are important is changes in wetlands. So different types of wetlands being threatened by climate change, for example, mangroves, or also mudflats, salt marshes, etc. And it also involves the salinity intrusion into drinking water, into coastal aquifers where we get our drinking water, for example. Yes, so this IPCC report that was issued this year, earlier this year, no, actually it was last year already, we've got 2015 now. It actually reinforced many messages of the previous assessment report. So it reinforced that climate change is happening, that it is a considered threat to human populations around the world. And it suggested the kind of actions, the kind of adaptations that might reduce the impacts of climate change. And it also called for urgency in action because, a lot is at risk, and the earlier we act, the less impacts we will experience. I mean, generally, maybe it's important to understand a bit what this IPCC report is and how it is written. So the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is, as the name is suggesting, an intergovernmental thing. So national governments come together and they suggest researchers, scientists from all countries involved in the IPCC that then collaboratively write this report. And the report is structured in different parts. There's a part on the climate science, so on the physical aspects. there is a part on the impacts and on what kind of adaptation one could take, and there is a part on mitigation, so how can we reduce greenhouse gases. And the report is actually then put together over a long period of time where researchers meet. There are several drafts. These drafts are then put out to the public in order to comment on those drafts. And then finally there are synthesis reports being made that are in the end negotiated line by line with the governments involved. So the synthesis reports, they're not really a pure scientific product, they're a product of a negotiation process amongst scientists and representatives of the governments. Thanks. I think this is a very important issue, this negotiation of the results of the IPCC report in the summary of policymakers. But first of all, let me say, it's just the final step. So there is a report covering, 2,000, 3,000 pages, structured into different chapters, different teams of scientists who are responsible for the different chapters, and all of that is public. And all of that is not negotiated. This is just a matter of the scientific assessment. And assessment in this sense means that the researchers, they get together, they read a lot of literature, and they discuss and form an opinion. So it is not just a summary of the literature, it is also sort of an expert judgment on the validity of the literature, on the methodological rigor of the literature, etc. And so we, the IPCC authors, come up with statements such as it is very likely that extreme events will become more frequent in coastal systems in the future. And then from this basis, there is a smaller group of researchers that produce the synthesis report. And this smaller group of researchers then selects statements from the big report to be included. And of course, this selection is somehow arbitrary. What do you want to highlight and what do you want to leave away? And this is also something where the governments, of course, have a great interest. The summary, the synthesis report is short, and what can you really say in, 10, 15 pages? How do you represent the information? What's the connotation of the sentences you write? And that has a great influence on what is the sort of mainstream interpretation then of the result of the IPCC report. So in essence, governments, they have their position on climate change, and this position is well articulated within the climate negotiations. And you see this position also in judging the results of the IPCC reports. Well, I think there is sort of one major obstacle, at least in the whole setup of the IPCC. The IPCC has emerged from a situation where it was necessary to prove the world that climate change is real. And the IPCC has done a great job in that. This was how the institution originates. And it has been collecting information that climate change is real, and it has risen awareness on that issue. And I think this is great and has done a good job. But I think the IPCC has not really moved beyond that. The whole structure of the report is not really solution-oriented. It's not, how do we now solve the issue of reducing greenhouse gases, or how do we adapt? It's more about showing the world, how big of a problem climate change is. The impacts will be very dramatic, and there is also, and no doubt, the climate change impacts, they're really threatening. But there's also a lot of uncertainty, it depends really on the climate sensitivity, it depends on humans' reaction and all that. So in essence, there are many things we don't know and we cannot know. We just can give an uncertainty range, which however is very large, in particular in terms of impacts. And so the IPCC has not really managed to change the perspective from making the world aware that climate change is an issue to finding solutions to climate change. And this perspective of the IPCC is really the perspective of that is, I think, also dominating the discourse on climate change in general. It is the perspective that, look, we just have to tell the whole world how dangerous climate change is, and then we're going to see responses. However, we don't see those responses. I mean, the negotiations show us that this mentality somehow doesn't work. And if you look closer into the problem, for example, from a social science perspective, I mean, there is no reason why this should work in the first place. I mean, you've got nations, all have their different interests, they want to grow, they want to develop, they want to bring economic prosperity. And why should a bunch of scientists, that come up with information how bad things are going to be in 50, 60 years, convince or lead to a convergence of those powerful nations having all vested interests in different things? I think this is a bit the misconception, and the challenge will lie whether the IPCC will manage to also support the solution stage, or whether it sort of remains in that perspective where it has been from its onset in terms of showing how dangerous the world is, or how dangerous climate change will be. And that also goes back to the issues that are being negotiated in the summary for policymaker and the debates that are in there. There are actually critical voices that show that the IPCC particularly picks up on the bad messages for the summary for policymaker, because they want to warn the world. I mean, it's a good intention, they want to show the world how dangerous stuff is. However, I don't think that is going to work. I mean, we know from a lot of social science research, for example, that people who are just confronted with things going wrong, they don't act. So I think that we need to change in perspective. We need to point out opportunities that solutions can bring, how we can shape our world. And this is sort of the solution-oriented perspective that I would like to see influence the IPCC, and also the wider discourse on climate change. I guess I just mean reformulating, recasting our knowledge into a different form. So it is, instead of only thinking that, look, if sea level rises, it's going to flood millions of people, we can turn that around and say, look, I mean, there's really an opportunity in steering development away from the coastal zone, or there's an opportunity in protecting cities and densely populated areas from rising sea levels. And this opportunity is also already evident today, like if you think about the tropical storms like Haiyan in the Philippines. This was not climate change, this was just, an extreme event. If we are better prepared, better protected, this is really an opportunity we can take to save lives, to do things in a more sustainable way. And this is something one should point out. I mean, efficient in economic sense, I think a lot of coastal protection can be economically efficient. I mean, we just know that, like densely populated areas, it makes sense to build dikes. And it's not a problem to build the dike 2 meters higher, if you think about London or the Netherlands or Germany. So we have those regions, you know, where there's a lot of wealth, and building a small dike for protecting a lot of coastal area, that's possible. So there are opportunities. But also, to take another example, I mean, one thing that has come up in the debate is the so-called ecosystem-based adaptation or disaster risk reduction. And this is actually something very practical, happening in countries, in developing countries, where people have realized if they reforest their mangroves, for example, that this protects against storm surges and against rising sea level, but at the same time it brings further benefits, such as honey and shrimp farming and other ecosystem services, other things you can get by introducing those mangrove forests. So we need to look for those synergies, you know, for those win-win solutions. And maybe another example to turn to climate mitigation would be also these ideas of economic growth through investing in green technology. You know, if you think about, I mean, Europe is just in a big crisis, you know, and many people are suffering a lot, in particular in southern European countries. And there is actually a lot of money that is not being invested. I mean, the capital markets, they don't know what to do with the money. So why, instead of austerity, why don't we start a massive investment program into green technologies? This would bring jobs for people. This would sort of solve the economic crisis and take the climate opportunity at the same time. So I think this kind of thinking, trying to combine opportunities, trying to find win-win solutions, is very important. And this is somehow difficult to combine with a sort of old IPCC and environmentalist narrative of climate change being very bad, being disastrous, and the whole exercise is one of burden sharing amongst countries, you know, who's carrying the burden of climate change. If you would want to turn that around and say, look, I mean, we have to move away from fossil fuels. There is now a great opportunity to develop new technologies, and I mean, technological development always creates jobs, you know, it can lead to economic prosperity. Let's try it out, you know, let's go for that. And this is the kind of thinking that I would find very favorable for the climate change issue. I mean, maybe I don't want to say that the rest, there's nothing wrong, you know, there's nothing, it's not that I'm not afraid that climate change will bring adverse impacts, you know, there is a real danger in that issue. But still, I mean, humanity is confronted with many dangerous issues, you know, there's the atomic bomb, there's war, and we have to confront those things, and I think there are opportunities out there to do so. So the whole climate change issue got started by natural scientists, and it was framed as a physical problem, you know, in essence. And this, I think, was very necessary for raising awareness that climate change is happening. But now it's different. Solving the issue, it's not a physical problem, it's a social problem. I mean, environmental issues are externalities, are effects of human action. And if we study those effects by physical science methods, we understand the effects, but we don't understand how to solve it. And this is the transition that is necessary within the IPCC or within the climate discourse in general. Climate science is very powerful, or has been very powerful, in shaping the discourse. And I think this was right so in a historical perspective. But it doesn't really contribute to solving it, because solving it is a problem, it's a social problem. Hence, we need social science. So for example, if you look about the issue of coming up with a global treaty on climate change, I mean, this means that different national states get together, they self-organize in order to come up with an international treaty. just providing information on the physical effects of that treaty does not help the people necessarily together, because there are many other issues involved that you would study from a political science or from a social science perspective. I mean, there are many concepts that have been used to speak about solving environmental issues, and some of which you have named: adaptation, transformation, resilience, sustainability, if you want, you could also take. And to be honest, I'm not a big fan of discussing those concepts, what's the difference between adaptation and transformation. And certainly some people see adaptation as to be more incremental, sort of fixing the thing we have, and see then transformation as a more radical change. I think for me, those words are not that important. What is important is the complexity of the social change we're speaking about. And certainly there are situations where issues are very complex. So if you think about resources disappearing, people living on a resource that's not going to be there anymore, groundwater, etc. And that is a massive social institutional change that we have to deal with. So what is important for me is to understand who are the people involved in this adaptation and transformation. What are their interests? What are the competing interests? What are the social conflicts? And understanding these and solving these, addressing these, that should be, that's the major task of both practitioners working in the field as well as researchers that are trying to do research that is meaningful for helping those kinds of situations. And maybe let me add, all those concepts, they are a fashion, there's a discourse emerging around resilience, that's suddenly very fashionable, and then that wears off again. I think this kind of cycle, is also quite important to bring new wind into the issue, and maybe to convince policy or to get money, and etc. So all of those concepts are important in this sense. But in order to bring solutions, I think it's all the same. We are dealing with very complex social institutional processes, social conflicts, and since decades we have studied those, in development research, in common pool or resource management research, now in climate change or transformation. And the issues remain complex, no matter how we call them. And this is, I think, something I would wish to see, that we acknowledge this complexity and maybe learn a bit more to differentiate, different types of complexities, etc. So I would see it a bit like in medical treatment, like sort of medicine or human health is very complex. And there are many specialists, special doctors around that are specialists for a certain aspect of human health. And then there are also general surgeons who are, who have an overview and can then send you to the specialist. I think this kind of thinking I would see very productive in the domain of solving social problems. What I see, or what I find has dominated so far is really these grand solutions. A new concept comes up, now resilience is the solution, and then the next concept, now transformation is the solution. I think we need to really get down into the details, understand the complexity, see different forms of complexity, find names for them, and then we need sort of a general doctor who's able to identify the general situation and then bring in a specialist maybe on ecosystems or maybe on institutions or maybe on law, whatever is found to be most important in order to solve. a very big question is, of course, how to institutionalize this kind of solution-oriented research and practice. And there are many answers, or many partial answers have been proposed, and I think we have to expand and we have to foster things that work. So it's a bit of an evolutionary approach, I would see, to forming institutions. Just to name a couple of elements that are floating around in the discourse, there is notion of those boundary organizations, that act at the boundary between knowledge production and those implementing stuff on the ground. And I mean, this certainly is a very important issue in the sense that as a researcher, you're paid and you get recognition for producing papers and finding something out. And that's a very different incentive than bringing about a solution on the ground. So by definition of, or by the purpose of the scientific system, it's not very good for solving issues on the ground. I mean, this probably differs in the engineering disciplines, but there the purposes overlap. I mean, sort of the scientific purpose is the purpose of solving problems on the ground, which is, an important aspect of our social life. So those boundary organizations, I think they are important, but I also think we need a bit more flexibility, and this is maybe very aspirational or wishful. So coming back to this analogy of the medical system, we need this flexibility to draw in expertise from different sides as it becomes relevant, I mean, if you go to your general doctor, and he might send you to a specialist for heart issues, or he might send you to a specialist for I don't know, other issues. And this is something that emerges during the process of solving, of treating the health problem. That's not something we know before. So now if you have boundary organizations or research organizations that unite a different specific set of expertise, then that means if you're confronted with a problem, they might not have the right set of expertise for the specific problem that you encounter. I mean, this needs to be very flexible in institutions that can then draw in expertise whenever required. I mean, in a sense, in a sense, we have those kinds of organizations. So we have organizations that have specific expertise and that work together and combine their expertise. The problem, however, is that most of those initiatives are defined a priori. So you write a proposal, you get money for a certain set of activities, and then you have to do those activities. So there's no flexibility in changing course, in changing strategy. Those, you have to define everything on the onset, you have to report, etc. So this kind of flexible problem solving is constrained by the bureaucracy of giving out money, etc. So solving that, of course, would mean to change the way research and also practice or money fostering social change is distributed, and I think that's necessary. So I mean, if I look now, I mean, how do I see the future? I mean, looking at a global context, sort of from my perspective, as I'm studying global phenomena, so I would like to answer that question sort of from the global perspective. And I think the 21st century is going to be a century of a lot of shocks that we will experience. And I mean, I think financial and economic shocks are going to be quite major. And I'm also afraid of armed conflict, and there is a real risk of a nuclear disaster. There's a real risk of armed conflict between China and other superpowers, I mean, possibly the US. And so we are living in this context of really major risks, climate change being one important one amongst them. And I'm afraid that we will not be able to change course without having experienced rather massive disruptions. On the other hand, I think we are learning how to deal with those disruptions, and I think there are many great examples out there. And as I said, pointing out those opportunities is very important. I mean, for example, Bangladesh has managed to reduce the number of people affected by coastal disaster massively over the last 2 decades. So, I mean, there is a lot of progress that I think will unfold with those massive disruptions. But I'm a bit afraid that we cannot avoid, in particular, a massive crisis of the financial system. We have not done a good job in changing it. I think there was actually no opportunity. The thing is, and this is maybe sounds a bit pessimistic, but institutional change is very slow. Things don't happen fastly. If you have a huge set of actors all having different interests and making money, I mean, there must not be any, bad purpose involved. It's just those guys trying to maximize their profit and trying to survive within their cultural context that gives them meaning, etc. And this machinery is quite massive, and I think we cannot avoid major disasters. Another potential risk, of course, are pandemics. I mean, I think we've been, we don't know, but it could very well happen that there is a major outbreak of a virus. So I'm hoping, or I see this century as really a century of learning to manage disasters and to learn from past disasters. That's sort of the way we have to deal, I think, with many issues.